Yeah. Good evening, everybody. It is my pleasure and an honor to introduce Professor Jim Crow, who is, as many of you know, the BIAA chair, but who is also a retired professor of classical archaeology from Edinburgh University, and who is currently also honorary fellow at Newcastle University, who is going to be speaking about his work on the longest Roman water supply line. So enjoy, everybody.
Thanks very much, Lut. Right, this is working perfectly well. Good. This year is the 1700th anniversary of the foundation of the city of Constantinople by Constantine. And almost exactly a month ago, there was a conference in Istanbul to celebrate that event. And I think it's suitable that, and the British Institute, although it's a British Institute in Ankara, has not neglected the Queen of Cities. The British involvement in terms of archaeology throughout the 20th century, and the British Institute sponsored David Talbot Rice's second excavations at the Great Palace, for instance. So I think it's right that we should remember that Anatolia, well, the range of the British Institutes includes the Black Sea, and it's quite appropriate that we should also consider this remarkable monument. 30 years ago, or just over 30 years ago, I had the benefit of a research permit from the Ministry of Culture in Turkey, and here I thank Gulgun for all the work she did in securing those permits. And before that, I had looked into in field work to the east of Trabzon on the Black Sea, but the trees got in the way in the forests, the Pontic forests, and it was quite challenging. So I decided that I'd move my attention to the west of Istanbul, and to this area of Trakya, which is the forested region bordering the Black Sea, west of the city, west of the Bosphorus. When we started work there, and Caroline Finkel, who I'm pleased is in the audience, will remember that, it was a region where camels still tramped through the forests. It was quite remarkable to think that this was in Europe, and here they were still using camels, because camels at that time were extremely valuable, not in the summer, but in the winter, because of their large feet and the very muddy forests in order to extract the trees. And on the right, you can see a slide of, this was actually a Turkish student using GPS to identify the situation of the Anastasian Wall, because our fieldwork initiated in that area was to document the Anastasian Wall. But shortly after we started work on the Anastasian Wall, I began to see monuments such as the one you see on the screen now. This is the Great Bridge at Kurşunluğame. So within those forests are not simply a great wall, a really very substantial wall, as long as the Antonine Wall in Scotland, but twice as big and high and all the rest of it, a great stone wall, but which runs across the peninsula from the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara, but also at right angles to that wall, a line of aqueduct channels and bridges, which up until then were largely undocumented. Now, within Istanbul, the aqueduct of what's often referred to as the aqueduct of Valens, or the Bozdoğan Kemeri, is, of course, a continuing impediment to traffic, as you can see here. And that was built in the 4th century, and the chronology of that is fairly secure, and I won't go into the details of it. So that's an indication of the scale of the new build, which was not derived from the time of Constantine, but from a little later, which was part of the development of Constantinople as a mega city in the 4th and 5th centuries. Now, the aqueduct channel on the top, and here you can see my colleague on the left, Paolo Bono, who was a hydrogeologist who worked with us. And on the right, my son, who is significantly taller than I am, he's nearly 2 meters, standing next to a walled up water channel. And in Istanbul, because of the presence of the Buzdoğan Kemer and the various features of it, we get some idea of the level of elevation of the distribution of the water within the city. And that's what I'll come back to when I've talked about the distribution outside the city. And that's a map from our 2008 monograph, which Richard Bayliss drew, showing the distribution of the water channels in the city. But the Byzantines knew otherwise, that there was water from a much greater distance. And this is a document which was essentially set to confuse. It's from a 10th century account of Constantinople, which attributes much of the monuments to Constantine, its original founder, even if he had nothing to do with them. And this document actually tells us that Constantine, or rather his son Constantius, brought water from Bulgaria. This is quite a claim. The Bulgaria in the 10th century was sort of more or less where the Bulgaria is today, but a bit further away. But in other words, it was a long distance away, and the people in Constantinople, liked the water, but they couldn't really be, most people obviously were not actually aware of where it came from. Now, interestingly enough, the first documentation of this water supply outside the city actually didn't occur until 1912. When the Bulgarians came during the First Balkan War. And this is a rather peculiar photograph that I acquired some years ago from Sofia, which shows Bulgarian officers. And without going into excruciating detail, if you look at this form of those buildings, there's a sort of crisscross of tiles, and they're all actually reused Roman tiles. And when we first went to this village, which is called Karacaköy, those houses were still there. They've all been knocked down now and replaced by concrete. So we can place that. It's actually almost the western end, sorry, the northern end of the Anastasian wall, and there are the Bulgarian officers with, I think, a rather uncomfortable Greek schoolmaster in the middle, but I'm not sure what he's doing there. And I don't know whether the Papas is Bulgarian or Greek Orthodox. But a man called Peter Oreshkov got bored during the winter of 1912, when the Bulgarian armies, having successfully got as far as the Çatalca lines, got stopped. And he then set about documenting, a bit like me when I first saw the aqueduct bridges. He thought, oh, we'd do something about this. And this is the first ever published illustration of that self-same bridge I showed you before at Kurşunlu. And it was published, in fact, in 1915 in Bulgarian in the journal in Sofia. Nothing much happened afterwards because, understandably, the whole of this region became an even more militarized zone than it had been before. So after the First World War, it was militarized and was inaccessible. So Dalman's study of the Buzdoğan Kemer notes the fact that the water came from a long way, but regrets the fact that he's not allowed to go and look for it. Feridun Derimtekin, who is one of my heroes, and I really ought to try and find a photograph of him, who was the director of the Ayasofya Museum in the 1950s and 60s, and had been a former cavalryman in the Turkish army, an officer. He was allowed access into Thrace, into the military zone, and he actually did some really quite significant discoveries. But he published them in a perfectly good journal which is concerned mainly with medieval archaeology, Archaeology. It's a French journal. And so it was ignored by all the Romanists, and so they took absolutely no interest in the monuments of Thrace whatsoever. And so any of the great books on, certainly up throughout to the end of the 20th century, ignored completely this line of aqueducts. It was really this man, Professor Kâzim Çeçen of Istanbul Technical University, who had throughout the 1990s published a whole series of volumes on the great achievements of Sinan and his contemporaries in terms of the Ottoman supply of Ottoman Istanbul, who really his last project, he died I think in 1998, his last project, which was to document the Roman water supply, and this is its Turkish version, and this is the title of my talk, the longest Roman water supply line. And throughout sort of although I never met Çeçen, and we were unaware of his project must have started few years before our archaeological documentation of the Anastasian Wall. But Çeçen, being an engineer, he never thought to go and ask the Ministry of Culture for a permit, so he just went in with his helicopter and his teams, and he sort of basically mapped it. He asked the villagers, have you seen a tunnel? And they said yes, and he showed them the tunnels, and he put them on, and he published this book in 1996. So we basically followed Çeçen and our own findings and then documented more. And the photograph on the right shows me working with a team from Istanbul Technical University in 2008 when we had a project which was really following up from Çeçen's work and included, I won't point him out, I can just about, it's that gentleman there, who is Celal Kolay, who was Çeçen's research assistant throughout this period. So, based on the work, Çeçen estimated on his mapping that the water supply system was 240 kilometers in length, extending as far as, let me just find if I can find it again. I'll try not to take more than a second about this. Yeah, that's it. There we are. Okay, going out as far as Vise, and he documented bits of the line all along here and all the way through to Istanbul. Basically, the channel consists of, in places there are channels, as you can see here, near to Pinarca. There are water catchments, this is again at Pinarca, and water was flowing. We went back to Pinarca about 10 years ago as a visit. The water had dried up because İSKİ, the self-same organization which had partly sponsored this work, had of course had now new pumping stations, and all the water table had been lowered very significantly because the water was needed in Istanbul. So this was the water flowing continuously from antiquity towards the city, but of course today it's now captured and taken away. With the help of Paolo Bono, who you saw walking across the Bosdo Ankara, we were able to identify the major springs. And here are the major springs, both for the first phase, which is marked in blue, extending as far as there and here, and then the later extension, which I'll describe, which is extending beyond Vise to Pinarca, to Pazarlı, including springs there and also there at Ergene. Interestingly enough, all the water here is flowing to the Ergene River, which then flows out towards the Aegean on the river Mariç or the Maritsa, or the Evros in Greek, whereas the waters in this direction are flowing either to the Sea of Marmara or to the Black Sea. So there's some really interesting, I mean, this is more complicated than I need to say this evening, but we've published much of this. The water, of course, flowed by gravity. It was a gravity-led system. Water developed in these springs here, which are karstic springs, and these sinkholes, and then was released in a series of springs, and that was then captured in that great circular cavity, which I showed you a couple of slides back, and then went through the tunnels. One tunnel I've already showed you, and this is Paolo standing in one of the larger tunnels. This is the very largest tunnels, which are over, Paolo was taller than me, so it was about this high. So it's about nearly 2 meters high and about 1.5 meters wide. And then it was led towards the city. And this is the last surviving springs at Kırkçeşme, where a Byzantine water channel was reused in the Ottoman Kırkçeşme channels, which are just to the north of the Bosdoğan-Kemer Bridge. Now, the landscape through which these water channels lies, as I've already mentioned, is wooded. That was the area where the camels were. And even today, this area is regularly cut down and coppiced in order for the production of charcoal. It's a sort of it's a cyclable, renewable regime. The woods are cut down, they're allowed to grow for 20, 25 years, are chopped again, and it's all turned into charcoal, which then helps you have a really delicious kebab in Istanbul. But this is not an easy landscape to negotiate, but at the same time, it's a landscape which enables the archaeology to be preserved. If it was more open, then the stones would have been robbed away, and in other places, the stones have been robbed away. And there you can see the great bridge at Kurşunlugeme, and beyond it, the line of the ridge of the Anastasian Wall, and the line of the channels as they course sinuously around the hills of Thrace. Now, the problem we faced was how to map this. Initially, initially we tried using GPS, and we had assistance from Istanbul Technical University, again from the geology department. They allowed us to have access to 1 to 25,000 Turkish maps, photocopies. We were allowed black and white, we weren't allowed in colour, and they had a big sign Gizli, which means secret on the top. But nobody actually, I didn't serve any time in jail, it was all right. However, we were very fortunate in being told by I think fourth-year engineering student at Oxford. He contacted us and said, "Oh, do you know that these maps in the Bodleian, which are British Army maps, which show this area of Thrace at a scale of 1 to 25,000, which is basically the old 2.5-inch map, for those of you who remember those maps." So basically, the British Army had acquired, after the First World War, a series of really detailed Ottoman maps, and those do exist in the public archive in Kew. Those maps were then in the Second World War, in case we decided to invade through Thrace into Nazi-held Balkans. Somebody in Britain or somewhere, I don't know, possibly in Cairo, created these extraordinary maps, and there's a set in the British Library in London, there's another set in the Bodleian. I guess there might be another one in Cambridge, but I've never tried. But these maps are then, on the basis of these maps, my colleague Richard Bayliss, who was really responsible for an awful lot of the annotation and the graphical work that we did on this project, he was then able to identify known structures and then, following this contour lines, produce this map which shows in the dark blue, it's the channels, the 5th century channels coming from deep into Thrace, and the yellow channels are the 4th century channels, which we see again. Now, I don't expect you to hold this image in your memory, but I'll be showing a number of different images just to show how this was produced in the early 2000s when we had a big Leverhulme project, Leverhulme funded project. So this was about 2002. Richard was doing this, and it was a terrific piece of work. But then subsequently, we had another project, and that was then all published in this volume, which we published in 2008, although we had to actually publish the maps in monotone. This is just to show you, Richard is down below, and that's a Turkish team from Istanbul Technical University. It was the very early use of GPS. The civil engineer, the surveyors in Newcastle University at that time, well, it still does, had a very important surveying department. They've renamed themselves geomatics, but that's what they are. The surveying department, and they had a Turkish postdoc who was associated with Istanbul Technical University. He was the man on the right, and so we were able to borrow some surveying equipment, which we used, and it was, I think, the first time that we were able to get an accurate calibration of the height of the water channels and to begin to understand how the system worked. So although this is before the publication of Çeçen's book, and Çeçen used basically the Ottoman maps, not the old Ottoman maps, but more recent Ottoman maps, but when we started to use GPS. And I just want to show you a couple of how over time different technologies have enabled us to represent the course of the aqueduct channels in this area. To the north, of course, is the Black Sea, and this is the line of the Anastasian Wall from the Black Sea down to the Sea of Marmara. That's the town of Silivri down here. So just look, that was the bridge at Kurşunlu is there, and let's just look at that boxed area. So this was a new project, also funded by Leverhulme from 2014. By this time I was at Edinburgh, and here I worked with a set of proper civil engineers, Martin Crapper and Simon Smith, Riley Snyder, who was my postgraduate, working on, we'll see some of his work in a minute, and also two civil engineers, Kate Ward and Francesca Ruggieri, who were working on different aspects of the water supply system through an engineering perspective, but through PhDs. And their work, you can download this from the Edinburgh University library site. So this is Francesca's version of the same area, but here she was using data derived from satellite imagery, not the sort of usual Google satellite imagery. This is satellite imagery called ASTER-GDM. And on that, she was able to then create a more detailed contour plan and perhaps more robust contour plan than we were able to take from those earlier Ottoman-derived British maps. And here you can see the channels, the early phase marked in blue and the later phase marked in red. And these are all the bridges, including Balageme, which we'll come back to, Kurşunluğame, that massive bridge, which we saw at the very beginning and we'll see again, and also the bridge at Talas, which I'll refer to a little later. And I now want to just look at, there's another development, and that development can be found in public. If you go onto the Istanbul Büyükşehir Belediye website and go into Harita, you get the most fantastic sequence of maps available if you know where to look. Because this is what you get on the left here. It's basically a LiDAR image, publicly available. It's a LiDAR image, it's just a screenshot of it. It's a LiDAR. LiDAR is a terrestrial laser scanning. And you go into Kabartma, and that's what you find. And I think you'll immediately recognize that that's the line of the Anastasian Wall. That's what you see in terms of the forests. And that's what you can see through LiDAR crossing the hills and turning, just like the Great Wall of China on a slightly smaller scale. But you can see also all the forts, all the towers, and here a small fort. But what you can also see is the line of the water channels. So this is from Francesca Ruggeri's map, which you can download from her PhD. So that's there, you can see the water channels, the line of the Anastasian Wall on her line, not accurately placed, but just generally placed, but then a more detailed view of this LiDAR, which shows you not just the wall, which is there, but also the line of the water, the channels. So what Francesca is showing in blue and red, you can actually see as a physical feature through LiDAR. And that's a sort of really quite remarkable. And as far as I know, nobody's actually, I mean, this is just observation. This was brought to my attention 2 years ago. And I've not really had the time to work through it. All I've done is to try and copy the images. So in case somebody withdraws the website, which is always a danger with a website, I'm just going to make sure I've got a copy of all these things so I can access them again. But I thought that was, and so that's the latest development, and there is the potential for people to work on this. So I want to move on now from mapping to thinking about the structures themselves. Outside the city, we have these huge bridges. There are basically 5 major bridges, and they all belong to the second phase, the 5th century phase. And this is Büyükgeme, it means big stretch thing, big bridge. And the middle pier is missing. This is collapsed. But it was a huge bridge, but never as big as the biggest bridge, of course, which is the one we saw at the very beginning, the one that had really caught my attention, Kurşunluğame. This is it's 135 meters long, and I think it's actually probably it's nearly 40 meters in height, actually. I think I've underestimated it a bit there. It's an extraordinary, it's not quite as big as the Pont du Gard, but then, you know, you don't get quite the same view as you do of the Pont du Gard, which is sort of framed and visible, but this emerges from the forest. And virtually, I wouldn't say nobody knows about it. In fact, you now get sort of on, I'm too old for Instagram, but things like Instagram, and, you know, people do go there and book photographs and things. And there is a certain amount of damage, but you know, it's an extraordinary monument, and it's pretty much. So there you can see it from a distance. This is from the west, actually. I won't go into how you could actually stop on the road, and if you know where to look, you get this view, especially if you've got a telephoto lens. And there you can see that there are 2 lines of channels, one at a high level and one at a low level, crossing the bridge. One is the wider, the bigger first phase and the second phase. And in fact, these channels, this is from Francesca Ruggeri's dissertation. Here you can see that over time, different channels and different bridges, essentially what's happening is that this is the first phase, and there are lots of little bridges like the one you can see on the left. And then around about 400, possibly after a big earthquake, these bridges need to be rebuilt. And so instead of lots of small bridges, they shorten these distances and create this bridge here, which is Kumarlıdere, and Büyükgeme is up here. So that's the channel and what we know about it. And there's much more can be said. We've documented some of it. Ruggieri's work has actually added as well in terms of the details about gradients and so forth. And there's much, much more work that could be done. But at least we've sort of, from building on the work of Çeçen, we've been able to, I think, make a pretty clear idea of what's there and what more can be found out. One of the other aspects of it was trying to estimate, how much did it cost? Well, we don't know how much it cost because we don't have figures from that period. And the 5th century, there's no actual text talks about this second phase of these huge bridges. Nothing at all is written about them. But at the same time, Riley Snyder, who was my doctoral student at Edinburgh, he actually went in and he did studies of the mortar, which we were able to bring back to Edinburgh, and he studied the mortar from the bridges and from the Anastasian wall, and he used as a volume in terms of the size of an Olympic swimming pool, 2,500 cubic meters of mortar. In order to build the water supply channels, you would have needed the equivalent of 456 Olympic-sized swimming pools of mortar just to construct the channels and for the bridges. So that's the scale of the undertaking. Because this new system was not 240 kilometers long. It was actually much longer. It was 426 kilometers. And you can add more on, but I'm not going to go into that now. And then there's the huge quantities of quarried stone which were needed, both for the tunnels and also for the bridges. It's a massive undertaking. And this sort of metrical analysis is actually very important in order to assess the amount of work that was required. And these are the estimates. For the 4th century system, it cost 11.3 million man days, and the 5th century, nearly twice as much, 21 million man days. And then he estimated that it would take 29 years to build the 5th century system if they worked 12 hours a day, every day of the year, and no allowance for anything else. So it's a pretty, you can get some idea of the scale of it. And then these bridges didn't, then I've mentioned an earthquake, and this is only mentioned in one text. But there's clearly something pretty radical happened in order to require the reconstruction of those bridges that I've showed you. And then if we look at some other bridges, this is Talas, which I showed you on the map a few slides before. And this bridge here, if you look on the right-hand slide, you can see there's actually the remains of an earlier bridge within this quite distinctive structure. And in fact, the whole bridge is a radically different design from the earlier, much more conventional Roman-style bridges, even however massive they might be. And this style, that's it. And this style here you can see on the left is the single example of an inscription in situ. So what we saw from Talas, that's 2 slides back, is actually can be, by analogy, can be dated to about the middle of the 6th century. This one here dates after 542, when this man Longinus, who had been the prefect of Constantinople, he'd ceased to be prefect in 542, and the inscription says quite specifically, former prefect, so it's after 542. So that allows us to get some idea of the restoration of the aqueducts. If I skip back to the previous slide, we also know there was another building phase, or we can recognize another building phase in terms of the structures of the buildings. This is one of the great bridges built in let's say, before 540. But you'll also see where my white arrow is, that there's a clear line there, and you can see it on the other side. And this, in fact, is evidence for a really significant restoration of the aqueducts. This was after the aqueduct system is known from a text to have been cut by the Avars in 626, which was the first siege of Constantinople. And so the long distance line was abandoned for nearly 150 years, although there was still the aqueduct of Hadrian bringing water into the city. So it wasn't as though the city was completely waterless, it wasn't. But then it was restored under the Emperor Constantine V. And then there's further restorations which go through into the 11th century on the bridges. And we can date this because of the use of particular sorts of bricks and so forth. And my final thing about the bridges, and this is another most recent publication, based on collected work from Paolo Bono, but by a team based in the University of Mainz, which is to study, do you see on the right-hand slide, this, it's a bit like the rings on a tree, the layers of sinter which have accumulated in the sides of the channels. And this is at Ergene. This is a long way outside the city, and this team from Mainz, with a whole group of European scholars, it was published about 3 years ago in Geoarchaeology, were able to identify that these sinter samples have accumulated over a relatively short period of time, probably less than 40 years. In other words, up until that time, the channels themselves were being regularly cleaned out. Probably not once a decade, but regularly cleaned out in order that the water. Now, we know from historical texts that this system seems to have been abandoned towards the end of towards the end of the 12th century. So that represents, essentially, the last 30 years of water flowing through the channels before the springs were breaking. So that's all been published. And this is, I'll end of this. This is again from Riley Snyder. And it's like a barometer of the life of Constantinople shown through water. Because on the very left, 130, is the aqueduct of Hadrian. Then the first extension in the 4th century. Then it's the new provision into Thrace at its longest extent. And then it's cutting by the Avars, and then it's restoration. And that persists up until the end of the 12th century. And then no more was that long distance system acceptable. So I now move on quickly to the urban networks within the city, and we've obviously we weren't looking simply at what was happening outside. We wanted to see what was happening inside. Now, the whole point about this long distance system is that it entered the city at a higher level than the earlier Hadrianic system, and as Constantine extended the city westwards, this is the Theodosian wall, this is the Constantinian wall, and Byzantium was here. So the Constantinian city is extending onto these high hills there, and this high area over here, and also this high ground there. And so that was why water had to come into the city at this higher level, and why it was necessary to find these springs at the appropriate heights. And here you can see the Bozdoğan Kemer on the left, and there the location of the Bozdoğan Kemer, and the high-level channels are marked in blue. Ignore the yellow channels because we've reassigned them, but the blue channels are the high-level channels coming into the city and ending up at the Binbir. And of course, within the city, through a series of studies, one by Jonathan Bardil, which was in our 2008 publication, and then another by Kerim Altuğ, who you'll see a little later in his PhD at Istanbul Technical University, and then Kerim worked with Kate Ward, and they came up with a total of currently, it's probably a few more now, 211 cisterns are known within the walls. And they vary in size enormously, and some have been turned into restaurants, like the one at the top. Others are tourist attractions, like the Yerebatan Saray, which has been recently restored. That's an old view. And of course, the Binbir, the 1001 columns, which we can see at the bottom corner. And I should say a little bit about this. And then, of course, in the outer part of the city, between the Constantinian walls and the Theodosian walls, but within the city walls, were these huge open reservoirs. This is the cistern of Aetius, and there were two others, of Asper and Mochius. And these were huge open-air cisterns, and they were constructed in the 5th century. So after the land walls were constructed, after the water supply itself had been extended, then these new great open reservoirs were opened up. But of course, the water had to be delivered through the city, and there are some places through excavations a few years ago as part of the metro system where water channels, water pipes were found. This is a road surface which has been removed, and it's actually revealed the utilities under the road, just as if you were to take up a road around here, you'd find utilities. Well, the utilities here are water channels. And these really haven't, there's a great deal more work can be done with these. But these subsurface channels have been recognized throughout the 20th century during various works. And on the left, you can see a whole series of stone pipe channels which were for water under pressure, which were photographed in the 1960s, and are now from the German Archaeological Institute. And this is from a wonderful new website in the German Archaeological Institute, which has revealed many of the many of the notebooks of Ernest Mamburi, who did a great deal to document the city throughout the interwar period and into the period just after the Second World War until his death in the 1950s. But here you can see in red more of these pipes and also the system of what he calls cloac, in other words, sewers. I'm not sure they're all sewers, but that's a question I still need to go into. So this is a recent view. This is a new redrawing which we did for a recent publication. But ignore the purple line, which is the high-level line going across the bridge, which I've already spoken about. But you can see how it's potentially heading towards the 1001 columns, the Bimbidere. But more interesting is the yellow line, which is the aqueduct of Hadrian, which takes a route which is very similar to the subsequent line of the Kirk-Cheshme system of the Ottoman city. And that one is heading, as we know from text, towards the Basilica system, or the Yerebatan Saray, which we've already seen. And I'll say a little bit now about not the most recent project, which is concerned with the Acropolis, the first hill, which is the area now occupied by the Yeni Saray, or what we more frequently call it, the Topkapı Saray, of the Sultan's Palace. Now this project started in 2021 with Lut van der Put as the principal investigator. It was a British Academy funded project and included Istanbul Technical University, Northumbria University, and Edinburgh and Middle Eastern Technical University, led by the British Institute. Water in Istanbul rising to the challenge. Now, there's lots more you can say about the contemporary side of that, but I'm only just really going to talk about the ancient side, and there you can see the Ottoman palace, and more importantly, you can see these sutarazi. These, we'll see one, we may not see one. These are the water towers of the Ottoman city. You'll notice that Hagia Sophia is somehow missing, but never mind. This is a view by one of our Edinburgh postgrads, Stefano Bordoni, who did the GIS for this project. That's the Yerebatan Saray. That's the situation of Hagia Sophia. And here you can see the walled area, which is enclosed within the Topkapı Saray. And all the orange squares are cisterns. And in fact, the area of the enclosed within the wall of that whole area down here, the area within the wall of the Saray, which includes the palace on the top, but also the Gulhane, gardens and park and so forth, that whole area includes over 33 cisterns. And yet this is only 5% of the total area of the city. It's the largest concentration of surviving Byzantine cisterns which are known from the city. And yet here is the great Ottoman area of the city. So it's an interesting. And here you can see a more detailed view, which shows the Church of St. Irene in yellow, Hagia Sophia to the left, and many of the cisterns which you can see there, and the Archaeological Museum. Oh, I've lost it. Oh, it's gone. The Archaeological Museum, which is between T20 and T22A. And all of the cisterns within the area of the Saray. So this was just an attempt to think about these cisterns. Suddenly stopped. Hang on. There we are. Think about these cisterns. What do they mean in terms of the topography of both the Byzantine city and how they were related to the early Ottoman period? Because quite clearly, many of them continued to be used, not necessarily for drinking water, but possibly for water for the gardens. And this is just the interior of one of these cisterns, which was photographed a few years ago by our colleague Çiğdem Özkan Aygun from Istanbul Technical University again. And this building here, in fact, reflects the plan of a church. So there was a church above it. And this will appear online in Anatolian Studies 2025, as a long article by these people. There's a discussion but amongst the material that we uncovered as part of this project was to look again at the baths which were situated at on the east side of the Archaeological Museum and were actually uncovered in the extension of an annex. But this didn't only include the bath building. Behind it is the wall of a cistern, but also, that's the cistern there, but these buildings here. And this is all The Archaeological Museum is to the top of the screen, and all these features, some of these features still exist, but most of these features are now lost. So it was a way of trying to understand the sort of long-term history of the Roman and Byzantine buildings and how these continued into the Ottoman period. Now, what we were able to achieve, I think, in all of these projects is to recognize actually the sort of continuity from Roman into the Byzantine and also into the Ottoman, because even if the long-distance channels were not used by the Ottomans, many of those long-distance channels, I'm pretty sure, influenced the design of Sinan's great bridges at the Marlova and elsewhere in the forest of Belgrade. And projects like this can only be achieved through the work of lots and lots of people. This is really a period of collaboration with various British universities and also, in particular, with Istanbul Technical University and other Turkish colleagues. And then this is just a few over the years from all of the projects that have worked with us on this project. And I'll end with this quotation, which comes from the preface to Kâzim Çeçen's 1996, The Longest Roman Water Supply Line, by Safak Ocak, who was the president of İSKİ, which, for those of you who don't know, is the Istanbul's water and sewage authority. And he wrote, 1600 years ago, the Romans expended lives and labor to bring water along an aqueduct more than 240 kilometers long to Istanbul, one of the jewels of the world. They created another monument to the destiny of water and mankind. The blue line is based on a map of Google Earth and is the line of the water channels. Some of those water channels we visited with the ITU team in 2008, 2009. But of course, what you can see there is the southwest corner of the new airport overlying those channels, and no recording was done. But at least we've made an effort to record an awful lot of the system. So I hope I've given you some insights of what has been achieved through collaboration over a long period of time, and also to recognize what needs to be done in the future. So thank you very much for your attention.